Hi everyone. Okay, so welcome to Module 5. This module is really all about the brain. So even though the textbook and some of the notes go into detail about, say, our visual system or our olfactory system, really what we're getting at here is what is the shape of the brain and how did it come to be the way it is today for Homo sapiens. And to do that, to get to that point, you're going to be reading about traits that are seen in other species, and you're going to be also learning about modern day Homo sapiens with reference to our evolutionary path. So what did Homo habilis have? What did Homo erectus have? And how does that lead us to where we are today with modern day Homo sapiens? And there's a few things I'd like you to keep in mind. One of them is when we talk about the brain in an evolutionary context, the brain is a soft tissue. Okay, so brain doesn't fossilize. So we don't go around and find fossils of brains. What we do find are skulls. And the pressure of the brain is so tight that even though there's a little liquid barrier between the brain and the skull itself, we still can actually see this imprint on the inside of the skull of the brain itself. So what we can do, and this is just putting it crudely, you can take a skull, you can fill it with silly putty or clay, and you can then see all the folds that are in that brain that would have been in that skull. What's interesting about that is then you can take that model of a brain and you can begin to look at how pieces of it have shifted over time. So you can take a Australopithecus skull, you can take a Homo erectus skull, and you can make some comparisons that way. And we could do the same thing with historic forms of monkeys versus contemporary monkeys. Remember, just as we've been evolving, so have the chimpanzees. So the chimpanzee of today is not necessarily the chimpanzee that was around 5 million years ago, okay, or even a couple thousand years ago. So keep in mind that as we've evolved, so have our genetic relatives. All right. And this is not to say that we came from apes. Remember that. That's not the case at all. There's a common ancestor. That's a totally different situation. Going back to the brain, though, what's interesting is that's called an endocast. When we take that fossil of a skull and we fill it with that clay, we call that then an endocast. What we can do is look for locations then on that brain, as I said, and that's called a cerebrotype. So we can actually pinpoint, say, 11 or 12 different structures, or even more now, on that brain, and we can look at how those have shifted over the evolutionary time. So that has allowed us to make inferences then about the development of language, development of the frontal lobe, and really get to this understanding about how modern-day Homo sapien brains are the way they are, and what sort of trajectory that we were on during our evolutionary past. So keep that in mind. The other thing that you're going to learn a little bit about is why we can't say that, well, if you're bigger, you have a bigger brain. Okay, if you're a bigger species, you have a bigger brain. Because if that were true, elephants would be geniuses and mice wouldn't be that smart at all. So it's always a case that you have to take into account the ratio of brain to body size. And a lot of this module will be dealing with that as well. Finally, I want to draw your attention to one last concept, and that is, there's an older argument from Foley in the 1990s that talks about some of the reasons that our brains grew, why Homo sapien brains grew. Now, compared to Homo erectus, our brains have not actually been growing that much. If anything, they've actually been shrinking over the last couple hundred years. But still, there was a major change in our social environment and also in our dietary context. So make sure you pay attention to the 3 reasons why Homo sapien brains grew, which will pop up in the module notes. I think that's all I really wanted to point out this time. Make sure you look over the objectives and that you're reading the textbook and keeping up. And before you know it, the midterm is going to be here, so just keep at it and we'll get through it together. Okay, take care.